In the 1990s, three distinct theoretical paradigms rose to prominence as attempts to interpret and shape the emerging world order. The three major theoretical contributions that stood out were Francis Fukuyama's concept of historical closure through liberal democracy, Samuel Huntington's civilizational theory of global conflict, and William Strauss and Neil Howe's cyclical model of a generational crisis. Each theory tried to explain the seismic shifts occurring in global affairs and recommended factors to be heeded in arranging international relations. Each framework offered orientation in a world no longer bipolar, no longer ideologically symmetric, and no longer governed by the strategic clarity of the Cold War. Each rested on its own set of historical assumptions, conceptual tools, and normative implications. One emphasized liberal democratic finality in the ideological evolution of humankind. Another foresaw enduring civilizational divides. The third outlined cyclical transformations of generational character and institutional legitimacy. Yet all were either misunderstood, ridiculed, or prematurely dismissed by Western security elites. Fukuyama's thesis was misrepresented as triumphalistic. Huntington's warning was dismissed as reactionary, and Strauss and Howe's generational model was almost entirely ignored. This neglect has contributed significantly to the intellectual blindness that now plagues Western security and foreign policy thinking. In The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992, Fukuyama advanced the idea that liberal democracy and market capitalism, having triumphed over fascism and communism, represented the ultimate form of government. Yet the core of his thesis delved into a more profound territory, namely the human quest for recognition or thymos, the ancient Greek concept signifying the soul's longing for honor, dignity, and respect. Drawing on Plato and Hegel, Fukuyama posited that individuals and nations are motivated not only by material interests, but by the desire to be acknowledged and respected as morally and culturally worthy entities. This anthropological, indeed ontological, transcendental axiom of recognition that was largely ignored by critics is foundational to understanding global conflict. Russia's post-Cold War experience is a case in point and illustrates this claim vividly. Rather than integrating Russia into a balanced global security architecture, as was initially envisioned, with institutions like the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, later dubbed the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, the West treated Russia as a defeated power. It ignored Russia's cultural identity, civilizational depth, and strategic red lines. NATO expansion, support for color revolutions in Russia's neighborhood, and the refusal to grant symbolic recognition fostered a deep sense of humiliation. Russia's response, from rapprochement with China to the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine, must be understood not only as strategic maneuvers, but as demands for recognition and acknowledgement of its national interest. They were less an expression of autocratic arbitrariness than a quest for status and dignity within the international community. The West, however, in its self-assured hubris, neglected the cultural and psychological reality of other powers and failed to see that security is not and should not merely be a technocratic matter of control, power, and influence. It is also a question of mutual symbolic recognition and patterns of order. Transcendental theories help us grasp this dimension and elevate political discourse beyond power games and ideological fixations, which often obscure clear judgment. When we use these frameworks, we resist the temptation to reduce politics to expediency or tribal reaction. Instead, we begin to see the deeper structures at play, moral, cultural, and historical, and are thus better equipped to act with integrity and foresight. If applied, potential Russophobe impulses or anti Russian sentiments would evaporate. Anti Russian pathologies could not take root. The tragedy of recent decades, and especially the escalation in Ukraine, is in no small part the result of this theoretical vacuum. The neglect of the thymotic dimension as a condition for a legitimate international order. At this critical juncture, Fukuyama's theoretical framework is complemented by Samuel Huntington's influential thesis from The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, published in 1996. Huntington argued that in the aftermath of the Cold War, the most significant conflicts would no longer be driven primarily by ideology, but by cultural and civilizational differences. The West's belief that liberal democracy would become a universal norm overlooked the fact that Fukuyama's end of history was an ideational concept, not the encouragement to impose liberal democracy by force and military might. As long as other nations don't find it by their own evolutionary processes, cultural and religious identities of other civilizations will endure, particularly Orthodox Christian Russia, Confucian China, and the Islamic world. Western secularism, individualism, and universalist ambitions appear increasingly decadent and alien to many beyond the Western sphere. Huntington warned that the West would face resistance not because others lacked modernity, but because they wished to preserve their own identities. Russia's self-identification as a Christian Orthodox civilization, openly hostile to postmodern liberalism, can only be properly understood within this civilizational framework. Cultural and religious identity, not merely economic interests or strategic calculations, will define the geopolitical parameters of the 21st century. Huntington's insight was that attempts to elevate postmodern Western values, especially unconstrained individualism and secularism, to a global standard are inherently flawed and are bound to meet resistance. Such efforts will provoke backlash from civilizations whose normative foundations differ fundamentally from the West's. The West's strategic attempts to export its principles through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, military interventions, or instigated proxy wars like the one in Ukraine have not led to integration, but to rejection and counter-mobilization. The internal erosion of the West's own value structure, especially the abandonment of its classical Christian worldview, has deepened the divide. From the outside, Western democracies appear not as moral beacons, but as civilizations in decline, morally confused, socially fragmented, and spiritually adrift. The increasingly vehement secularization and the resulting socio-political transformations of Western democracies were seen by many states outside the orbit of the USA and the European Union as a decadent and self-destructive decline rather than as an ideal worth striving for. A perception that invites defiance rather than emulation. Under President Putin, Russia has repositioned itself as a classically oriented nation state, drawing on Orthodox Christian traditions and asserting its civilizational independence with its own historical development, cultural imprint, and nation-state sovereignty. It rejects liberal internationalism not because it fails to understand it, but because it understands it all too well, as a force that undermines its spiritual and national sovereignty. Russia's deliberate self-identification as a Christian Orthodox civilization, positioned in opposition to postmodern liberalism, must be interpreted within a distinctly civilizational context. In this light, understanding Putin, the Russian Federation, is a good and pertinent thing, not a bad and contemptible one as it has been cast in recent years by Western political elites and their connected media entities. By insinuating that understanding your adversary is bad, they try to suppress any factual objection to the one sided approach they took to judge international relations and the ongoing war in Ukraine. They forgot that the statesman-like strategist has always distinguished himself from ordinary ideologues and low-ranking politicians by his ability to assess an opponent's political military capabilities and, more crucially even, their strategic concepts and security interests. The West's failure to acknowledge Russia's civilizational status and legitimate national interests has led to a rupture whose geopolitical consequences we are now witnessing and which are shaking the international system today. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most illuminating theoretical model to explain what's happening right now. A third and highly insightful framework for understanding current events is offered by Strauss and Howe's Fourth Turning: An American Prophecy, published in 1997. This model connects prevailing intellectual narratives with tangible developments in power and politics. While the theory originates from American history, it has increasing relevance for understanding global geopolitical dynamics given the widespread impact of US policy in both national security and international affairs. Their thesis is that Western societies undergo a cyclical rhythm of institutional decay and renewal approximately every 80 to 100 years, each cycle having four turns culminating in a transformative crisis, a fourth turning, a time in which the old order collapses and a new one is born. They predict that such a turning will begin in the mid 2000s. Neil Howe, the surviving co-author, wrote a sequel to their original book entitled The Fourth Turning is Here in 2023. In this follow-up, Howe argues that the crisis is indeed underway. It began with the 2008 financial crash, the rise of populism, collapsing trust in institutions, and mounting geopolitical tensions, all of which are symptoms of this generational upheaval. These disruptions are not anomalies, they are part of a broader generational reckoning and signs of a deeper systematic transformation. The current fourth turn will likely go on into the 2030s and eventually mark the end of an overstretched growth narrative. Increasing institutional erosion, polarization, economic instability, loss of trust in the media, academia, and electoral processes, and escalating geopolitical tensions from Ukraine to Asia are symptoms of this upheaval. Since the beginning of the fourth turn, decisive proceedings have reflected the disintegration of the old order. Events such as Trump's election in 2016, Brexit, the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, the Black Lives Matter riots, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the erosion of supranational institutions like the EU or NATO are exponents of this cyclical shock. These developments embody the disintegration of an alleged postmodern consensus, and this fourth turning marks the return to questions of sovereignty, identity, national purpose, and strategic self-assertion. Donald Trump's re-election in 2024, seen through this lens, is not an anomaly but a historical response and an expression of an ongoing cyclical moment by a generation expressing desire for strong leadership, seeking national renewal, and restoring cultural trust amid institutional collapse. Trump's foreign policy, frequently criticized as inconsistent and or unpredictable, can be understood as an embodiment of the cyclical imperatives described by Strauss and Howe. His rejection of multilateralism, his focus on sovereignty, and withdrawal from liberal global interventionism reflected not isolationism, but the end of an unsustainable globalist phase. His Monroe Doctrine style realism marked a reassertion of strategic restraint rooted in national interest rather than ideological dogma. The geopolitical implications are profound. Trump's pivot away from expansionism, the rise of populist movements, the weakening of supranational entities all signal a tectonic shift, are manifestations of a deeper change and signs of strategic realignment in international relations. The multipolar world order, the rise of China, the strategic solidarity of authoritarian states, but also the global resistance to Western universalism mirror the cyclical upheaval that Strauss and Howe described and corroborate their diagnosis of generational crisis and institutional reset. Whether Trump's agenda is the product of deliberate philosophical reflection or an intuitive response to historical necessity, I put aside at this point. But one thing is clear. America First represents a civilizational repositioning. It renounces globalist idealism in favor of realism, sovereignty, and cultural affirmation. Yet the transatlantic security establishment remains trapped in outdated paradigms, fixated on expansion, deterrence, and confrontation. The European Union's calls for massive military buildup on the implausible premise that Russia seeks continental conquest are emblematic of this outdated approach. Such a premise is not only fundamentally flawed, but borders on the absurd, revealing a significant disconnect from strategic realities. The widespread acceptance of this contrived threat scenario by most European member states, and the enthusiasm with which political and media elites adhere to this fake threat model and propagate these narratives, underscores a lack of deeper intellectual engagement of stakeholders in European security planning with the true dynamics of political affairs. This orientation is heavily influenced by a deep-seated and often irrational Russophobia, a posture rooted in inadequate historical, political, and cultural understanding, as well as a failure to comprehend the core of Russia's strategic thinking. They double down on unsuccessful assumptions and cling to an order that no longer exists, while ignoring the very theories that could help them understand why and illuminate the path ahead. Fukuyama taught us the centrality of recognition. Huntington exposed the reality of civilizational pluralism. Strauss and Howe charted the cyclical rhythm of renewal through crises. Together, these frameworks offer a foundation for rethinking international order, a way to reimagine a global order not as a universalist abstraction and flat liberal consensus, but as a dynamic interplay of sovereignty, identity, and historical transformation. By applying these frameworks, we move from mere reaction to genuine understanding, laying the groundwork for more thoughtful and principled policy decisions. A key strength of transcendental thinking is its ability to rise above the immediate, steering us clear of ideological bias and power struggles. The end of the Cold War offered the West a historic opportunity to create a stable, inclusive world order. That opportunity, as said in the beginning, was lost. Now, 3.5 decades later, we are living with the consequences. But we're also facing a second chance to make things right this time around. To restore peace, especially within Europe, and to re-establish the credibility of Western strategy, it is essential to abandon failed doctrines and draw upon the theoretical wisdom of earlier generations. This demands the adoption of a renewed idealistic realism, one that honors cultural sovereignty, acknowledges civilizational diversity, and responds to the timeless human need for recognition. The moment for genuine philosophical engagement and strategic thinking and statesmanship has arrived. I urge all who are responsible for shaping policy to meet this challenge with the seriousness it deserves. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I will be back. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Take care, God bless, and I'll see you hopefully soon.